In this lesson, we'll look at a couple of different ways of rendering out an animated sequence from inside of Max. Alright, so up until this point, we've really just been working with still images and still renders. Now, within Max, there's lots of different situations where you're probably going to want to render out some kind of an animation, whatever that may be. So within Max, there's a couple of different ways of actually doing that, and we'll look at a couple of these methods. But let's first set up a really simple animation. Alright, so what I'll do is just keyframe some of the material colors actually changing on these spheres. So let's go in, and I'm going to press the M key on my keyboard to open up the material editor. So let's take this orange material, drop this in here. Alright, and within Max I'll go ahead and turn on my auto key so that way we can actually start to make some of these changes. So what I want to do is just keyframe this material, changing from orange to some other color and then back to orange. So what we can do is let's copy this material color, or the diffuse color in my case, and I'll render out maybe just a 10 frame sequence here. So go forward to frame 10. Maybe change this to some kind of a blue. Press OK. You'll notice that this has now been highlighted, meaning a keyframe has been applied to this, and we can see down within the time slider that these keyframes have been applied. So you can see now we go from orange to kind of a blue color. Now back in frame 20, let's set this back to orange. You recall just a moment ago I had copied that orange color from this viewport, so just right click, copy. Now we'll go back to frame 20, right click, and paste. And you can see now that'll make a new keyframe. So we have something that now goes from orange to blue, back to orange. Okay, so now that I have that set, I'll turn off my auto key. And now let's start to look at some ways of actually rendering this out. So I'm going to start by opening up the render setup. Let's come in, and we'll start by going over to the Common tab. This is where we can start to now begin setting things like the frame range. So let's say we want this to start at frame 0 and end at frame 20. All right, below this we can choose the area that we want to render. More than likely you're going to want to render the actual view itself, which is the exact same setting that we had looked at a little bit earlier in our render frame window. So again, as opposed to view or selected, we'll make sure that we do have this set to view, so that way it actually does render out the entire image. Alright, scrolling down a little bit further, we can change things like the output size. So right now I'm using 640 by 480. If we want, we do have a few different presets that we can choose from, so if you do need something particular, or we could also always come in and just use our custom settings and just start to adjust some of these settings any way that we want. So if we needed something a little larger, maybe 800 by 600, could type that out, and now that's the dimensions that this will be rendered out in. In my case, I'm just going to work with the 640 by 480 setting. And now this is really important. Once we have this set, we now have to choose whether or not we want to write these files out. Up until this point, we've really just been rendering these into the picture viewer and then doing whatever we want with them. Or I should say rendering these into the rendered frame window. And then from there we could just overwrite those the next time we render, or we could choose to save them out from there. Now what we can also do is choose to actually write the file out directly from this render setup, so that way as soon as we start a render, this file will be written out. So let's go to Files, and you can see by default it's going to dump this into the render output folder. So let's go in and give this a name, something like animation, and then we can choose the actual format that we want to render this out in. So we can use something like a file sequence or an image sequence. So that way, as we render this out, it will actually create a new file or a new image file for every single frame in our render. So if we were to render this out in a file sequence, I like to use something like a Targa image file. It gives a good combination between a nice high-quality file, a nice high-quality image, but at the same time it's a relatively small file size, so good combination there. Now we can also choose to render this out in a movie format, something like an AVI or a QuickTime. Now, I would actually recommend against rendering either one of those out. The reason is because as we're starting to render this out in some kind of an image file sequence, we'll actually get one file for every single frame. Now, that means we'll have a lot of files, but as each frame is rendered, we get the file itself. So if this were to somehow crash partway through, or if the file were to become corrupted, at least we still have all of the frames that have been rendered out so far. And then if Max were to crash, all we'd have to do is go back into the render setup, set the start frame to the new frame at which we crashed, and just keep on going. So we really never lose any work if we're rendering with an image sequence. However, if we render out with an AVI or a QuickTime, that's not the case, because this file is really not usable until the entire sequence has been rendered out. So if Max were to crash partway through, we've now basically lost all the time that has been spent writing this file out, and we're basically going to have to start all over again. So I'm going to set this back to a Targa file sequence, or a Targa image sequence. All right, we'll save this out. All right, we'll go ahead and set this to a 32-bit in case we want to keep any alpha channel information, which really shouldn't matter in my case because there really is no alpha channel to capture. But if ever you did have that need, it is there for you. So at this point now, we have the start and end frames that have been set up. We have our dimensions that have been set up. And we have the name of the file that we want to write out. And so now at this point, all we have to do is begin rendering this out. And you can see the render will begin. Right? And as soon as that particular frame is done rendering out, it'll move on to the next one. So it's actually rendering our entire sequence directly within this rendered frame window. If we take a look inside this render output folder, you can see here's the first frame that's been written out. And as soon as the second frame's done, that will be rendered out as well, or written out as well. So next frame just finished up. Here's that frame that just got rendered out. So it's going to go through this entire process until it reaches the end frame, whatever that happens to be. In my case, that's going to be frame 20. All right, and once that sequence is finished rendering out, we can do really whatever we want with it. So from here, we could take this file sequence into something like After Effects or Toxic, Nuke, Fusion, whatever the case may be. We could also take this into something like Virtual Dub if you didn't have either one of those apps, and simply play that back and do whatever we want with it from there. In my case, I'm actually opening this up inside of FCheck, which is something that comes with Maya. But you can see very quick and easy to play this back. And like I said, if this were to somehow crash partway through, I don't lose all of these rendered frames that would otherwise have been lost if I tried to render this out in a QuickTime or an AVI. If it crashes at frame 9, all I have to do is go back to Max and set it to render frame 10 through 20, pick up right where I left off. All right, so that's one way of actually rendering out within Max, actually coming into the render setup and setting our frames and our size, things like that from within this panel. Now we can also take advantage of the batch renderer. So that can be found inside the rendering menu, and if we scroll down and look for batch render, which is kind of down toward the bottom, we can click on that, and this will pull open a little bit more of a simplified window. Now this gives us the ability to start to render out different scene states and things like that, which we're really not going to talk about scene states in this lesson. We do talk about scene states a little bit more in our Introduction to Mental Ray course. But basically all we have to do is come in, add a new state, which is basically what we want to render out. We can choose what camera we want to render from, which output path, and a lot of this is being read from the render setup. But what we can do is actually start to override these. So all we have to do is select the state that we want. We can override these, and so now we can say, let's maybe say instead of frame 0 through 20, we do frames 10 through 20. And we can also set our height and width, aspect ratio, which camera we want to render from. So it's a lot of the same exact things that we had within the render setup. It's just that this can be a little bit easier to very quickly come in and start to set all the appropriate parameters. And then once you're ready, just hit render and you're good to go. Right? And then of course here we could come in and start to define some kind of a new output path as far as writing this out to some other directory or some other file format, something other than what we may have specified within the render setup. Right, so that's a look at a couple of different ways of rendering out some kind of an animated sequence from within 3ds Max.